Hello fighting game fans, what is up? It is I, FGF Chris, and today we're going to be talking about two topics related to fighting games. One of them is going to be about the aesthetics, the art style, basically the visual vibe you get from a fighting game created by their respective companies. Then we're going to be talking about the topic of crossovers. Basically, there's certain video game companies out there that release their intellectual properties and franchises to another company that makes video games. And a good example of that would be like Marvel vs. Capcom or Capcom vs. SNK. And we will be talking about that as well. But now we're going to get our paintbrushes ready and talk about the art of fighting games. The aesthetic, basically the pixelations, the cell shading, all that beauty that goes into making the characters, the backgrounds, and the themes of a fighting game very presentable. I'd like to break down the in-game art of fighting games into 4 different categories. Those categories will be pixelated, realistic, cartoon, and anime. So those are the 4 categories that I basically associate the art style with when it comes to fighting games. First off, let's take a trip back to the early 1990s when the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo remained the king of video game systems. Now you gotta keep in mind, both systems had only 16-bit graphic capabilities. And that's basically where pixels were very, very prominent. Whether you played Sonic the Hedgehog or Super Mario World, you could see that every character and the backgrounds have pixelations, rough edges that make the characters in the background look a little bit raw and undefined. And this was the case for Capcom's Street Fighter that was released on the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo, as well as a bunch of SNK games that were ported from the Neo Geo AES onto the SNES and the Genesis as well. Also, you have companies like Midway, who created Mortal Kombat back in the day, that looked very pixelated too. You would find a bunch of pixelated graphics, like 16-bit to 32-bit graphics, that stuck around for many, many years since their conception. And one famous company that basically used pixelated graphics for the longest time in video game history, and when I say pixelated, I mean 12, 16, 32-bit graphics. Once it kind of exceeds 32-bit graphics, I wouldn't really say it's pixelated. It's a little bit more polygonal, I guess. But the company that really kept the pixels going was SNK, Neo Geo, a company that prided itself on fighting games like Fatal Fury, King of Fighters, Art of Fighting, Samurai Showdown, and the list goes on. They used the same graphics for their fighting games from the early 1990s well into mid-2000s. One of the last fighting games that Neo Geo has produced that used very similar graphics, pixelations that they used since 1994, has to be King of Fighters 11. That game came out in the early 2000s. I mean, that's more than a 10-year span, like a 8, 9, 10-year span of using very similar graphics and pixelations for their games that long. The next art style was to succeed the pixelation art, and I'd like to call that art style the realistic style. That hasn't come around until what I believe to be the Sega Dreamcast days and the PS2 days. With the Sega Dreamcast, you had a few games that came out that were 3D fighters. And one very notable one was Soul Calibur, the first Soul Calibur. It was a very realistic looking game, and that was in the realm of 3D fighting. And you could see all the characters having very distinct, normal, humanistic facial features, height, width, whatever. It looked like a person. And with the PS2, they released a game called Tekken Tag Tournament, and the characters look real. It's like, oh my god, they went from pixelation, this unrefined look, to very, very realistic polygon sprites for the characters. And you saw this a lot in the early 2000s. All the renditions of Tekken that came out after Tekken Tag followed the same suit, making the characters look very realistic. And the same with Soul Calibur, then DOA. I believe Dead or Alive came out for the Sega Dreamcast as well, and the PS2. And that game was like, oh my god, fan service. It's like, wow, these girls, they look real, but a little bit too real, if you know what I mean. Also, around the same time as these very realistic 3D polygon characters and backgrounds were prevalent in the fighting game universe, they basically tried to, certain video game companies tried to make anime style and cartoon style. Good examples of this, and this is like 2000s, 2010s, but a good example for the anime art style would be Guilty Gear and BlazBlue. Those two games by Arc System Works were very anime-like. The characters looked like they belonged in a shonen modern anime series, and it's pretty cool. They have a lot of like fan service in it as well. And then cartoony art was prominent in Super Street Fighter 4 or any of the Street Fighter 4 renditions. It looked very cartoony. And you could even say the same for Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, even though that was more of a pixelation type game. And you could also say the same for Skullgirls that came out, in 2010s. And yeah, so basically you got all these arts, these interesting art styles. You have pixelation, realistic, anime and cartoon. And now sometimes they would blend the two together a little bit. For example, with Mortal Kombat back in the early 90s, it wasn't only pixelated, it was also very, very realistic looking. They actually had physical actors mapping out the characters' moves in the game. And, they used a real template of actual people to turn them into pixelation sprites. And that's pretty interesting, Another good example of like a cross art style would be Project Justice and Rival Schools that was released for the PS1 and the Dreamcast. Well, Project Justice was released on the Dreamcast while Rival Schools was PS1. But that game kind of went the more 3D realistic route with like anime overtones, if that makes any sense. And that's pretty awesome. So yeah, there's a place for art in a lot of games. It's nice to see something fresh, something unique. And no art style is the same in their respective companies. I mean, if you look at King of Fighters' pixelated graphics and compare it to Street Fighter's pixelated graphics, you would say that they do have their differences. And they do have a variety and their own take on what it looks like. And that's important. You can't have a bunch of Street Fighter clones out there or, Dead or Alive clones out there. You gotta have diversity when it comes to art. In my opinion, at least. Okay, let's move on to our next topic. Crossovers. Okay. Crossovers is basically the ultimate form of fan service for any fighting game enthusiast. Or any video game enthusiast. If it's a crossover with an RPG game, or a crossover with a shooting game, it's the same fandom as a crossover with a fighting game. And it's pretty neat. The history of crossovers in the fighting game universe is a pretty massive one. And it wasn't shortly after Street Fighter II that crossovers became a thing. In fact, one of the most notable and ambitious crossovers of any fighting game franchise has to be SNK. And this is back in 1994, okay? And I'm pretty sure you guys are thinking, oh, Marvel vs. Capcom is the ultimate crossover, or SNK versus Capcom and vice versa are the ones that were the most ambitious. But I will say the one that was the most for its time had to be in 1994, King of Fighters 94. With King of Fighters 94, they didn't bring in just other characters from fighting game franchises under the SNK name into the game. They brought in everything. Okay, now, there are a lot of SNK games that came out in the late 80s, early 90s, prior to King of Fighters 94. There were a few games that came out by SNK in the late 80s, and two of them were Athena, which involved a magical girl that flew around and destroyed enemies. She was like a psychic goddess, basically. Then you had a game called Akari Warriors, where it's a shoot-'em-up game, top to bottom shoot-'em-up game, that you play as two characters, Clark and Ralph. I think they were named something different back then, but Clark and Ralph is what you have representing those characters in the King of Fighters franchise. And then you had a lot of sports games that SNK created. And then you have the fighting games, of course, like, Fatal Fury, Art of Fighting. And, yeah. You had a big variety of different franchises out there under the SNK name. And they all became fighting game characters in King of Fighters 94. That is pretty freaking awesome. You have the Akari Warriors team, the Psycho Soldiers team, which is Athena's team, and then you had the USA Sports team, which was supposed to represent the sports game that SNK has produced. And that's pretty awesome stuff. I have to say, that takes a lot of balls to, create a fighting game with that many intellectual properties thrown in. Then you have crossovers like Marvel vs. Capcom and Capcom vs. SNK. And one that's coming up here pretty soon is BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle. It basically is a very anime-style fighting game that does a crossover between BlazBlue characters from the Persona games, and also Ruby, and other various intellectual properties and franchises crossed over into it as well. And it is freaking awesome looking, yeah. But yeah, basically, fighting game crossovers kind of bends the rules of what a game should be like. It basically adds new elements and new fandoms, for like the fans of the company, and it's really freaking awesome. Then you have certain games that don't do like a full crossover, but add guest characters from different franchises in as well. Like, one famous example is Soul Calibur. In Soul Calibur 2, if you get the GameCube version, you can play as Link. With the PS2 version, you could play as Heihachi. And the Xbox version, you play as Spawn. And every single time Soul Calibur would create a game after Soul Calibur 2, it would have guest characters from different franchises. Not only that, one really surprising character crossover that I really enjoyed was Mai Shiranui crossing over to DOA. Basically, Mai from the King of Fighters series and Fatal Fury series crossed over to DOA, and it is just like wow, this totally freaking works. Tekken 7, they have they have Akuma from Street Fighter, Geese Howard, and Noctis now. So it's like, oh my god, wow, if you are a fan of all these companies, whether they're fighting game characters or not, that is pretty freaking awesome that they include them and bridge the gap of different fandoms into one universe. Well, anyways, that's all the time we have for this discussion. You guys take care, keep listening and watching my stuff. Later.